Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the patch 5.3 first half banner review, aka 30 plus minutes of me being very angry. This banner pisses me off. And let me get this out of the way. It's not because the banner's that bad. It's because I really wish that the second half 4 stars were on the first half. It feels like they intentionally gave a really good 4-star lineup on the second half and a pretty bad one on the first half, and decided to put both of the new units in the first half as a way to try to manipulate people into going for the rerun characters they already have just to get the good 4 stars that are with them. It pisses me off, but let's still talk about the banner. I'm very unhappy with it. Anyways, let's yap. So Mavuika is being run with Bennett, Diona, Kachina. And then you also have Citlali, so 2 new characters, obviously a lot to say about both of them. And we have the weapon banner with each of their individual signature weapons. The Stringless, Sacrificial, Sword, Favonius, Codex, Favonius Lance, and Lithic Blade. Mavuika and Citlali. For the both of them, I've already posted a pre-release video that you'll be able to watch if you want an elaboration of my thoughts on them. But if you don't want to go and watch that, or if you've already watched it but you want me to refresh your memory, Mavuika is looking like a fairly strong character that is also pretty borderline manipulative, in the sense that her performance is going to heavily depend on whether or not you have the characters that are good with her. And the characters that are good with her are a lot more specific than is the case for a lot of other carries. And what I mean by that is that in Mavuika's teams, you need to have some fighting spirit generation. I'll get into situations where you don't, but at a baseline, you kind of do. And fighting spirit is generated by mainly Natlan characters using their Night Soul points. The thing is, you want to play Mavuika as a carry, that means you need to play Natlan support characters, and the amount of Natlan support characters we have isn't particularly high. And then on top of that, the ones that aren't 5 stars are either not all that great, like Kachina, or not all that synergistic with Mavuika, like Auroron. Because of that, your performance on Mavuika will vary a lot between if you have Xilonen and or Citlali versus if you don't. Now, a lot of people went for Xilonen because she was a pretty good unit. So if that was the case for you, then that's not really too big of a problem outside of potentially preventing you from using Xilonen on your other side. But there aren't that many teams where Xilonen is as important as she is in Mavuika teams, at least. That being said, if you're someone who didn't go for Xilonen because you were saving for Mavuika, honestly, f you, I guess. This is Hoyo telling you to go f yourself, and that only going for characters you like will get you heavily punished. If you don't like Xilonen and you don't like Citlali, your Mavuika teams are not going to be the greatest. Personally, I think that's a really shitty thing to do, and it makes me angry. And that's before I even get into the 4-star bullshit that I've slightly mentioned previously. Just the fact that she's as reliant as she is on Natlan supports is really rough for people that just kind of want to get her, but aren't necessarily able to get all the units they want because they don't have an infinite amount of primos. Does that mean that you can't play her without other Natlan characters? No. Characters start with full energy, and in Mavuika's case, that means just that she starts with 200 fighting spirit. So for those of you who don't know, Mavuika's burst, instead of relying on elemental energy like every other character in the game, relies on fighting spirit, which is effectively a tally of the amount of Night Soul points you've spent. She herself spends a total of 90 Night Soul points over a rotation, and then if you use other Natlan characters, they will add to that tally. And you also get a tiny little bit of fighting spirit from using normal attacks, but it's mostly from spending Night Soul points. If you're using Xilonen, you'll get 90 fighting spirit because you spent 90 Night Soul points when you did your EN2. You get a little bit more because you did some normal attacks, but we can round it to 90. She caps out at 200, and she can use her burst as long as she has 100 or more. So she can technically use her burst at 100, but the damage of her burst initial hit and the additional damage to normal and charge attacks you get from the burst buff scale with fighting spirit. And if you burst with 100 fighting spirit, she's not particularly good. What that means is that with extended rotations, you're generally going to be better off using a worthless Natlan support than a good support that doesn't generate Night Soul if you don't have Xilonen or Citlali available to you. However, because she starts with full fighting spirit, the full 200, and because her numbers are pretty good and she has pretty high DPR, so DPR refers to the amount of damage you do in one rotation. Generally, both DPS and DPR matter, because DPS will not always be inversely directly correlated with clear time, in the sense that a team that has 50k DPS, but in a 20-second rotation, will deal 1 million damage. But if the enemy has like 1.2 million HP, you're going to need to go through the setup of your second rotation anyways. And so your clear time is not actually going to be that 24 seconds that it should take if you just look at the DPS. Because Mavuika's DPR is fairly high, she's not a character that has particularly short rotations when you're using her as a carry. Because her DPR is fairly high, it is very possible that you'll be able to kill a chamber in only one rotation. And if that is the case, then what you can do is just start your first rotation with 200 fighting spirit, pretty much kill the enemy, and then just go back to Mavuika, use your E, and just wait until the Night Soul points are gone, and you'll start your next chamber with 170 fighting spirit or something. So all of that to say, there are ways to like cheat to work around it, but it will be really cringe to do, and it won't be something that'll work particularly well, especially in chambers like the current Abyss, where you've got a bunch of different waves, so it's generally somewhat overly optimistic to consider the situation where you one-rotate a chamber. She'll also be able to just use the bad Natlan supports like Kachina, and the ones that have bad synergy with her like Auron, and the main reason why I say that Auron has bad synergy with her is because Mavuika is a character that synergizes very, very well with multiplicative reactions. If you compare her to a character like Arlecchino, Mavuika can react a larger portion of her damage than Arlecchino can, which means that playing her in teams that don't have those multiplicative reactions, those melt and vape reactions, will hurt her damage more than playing Arlecchino in those teams hurts her damage. That's not to say that the Auron teams will be bad. If you have those constellations on Auron and Chevaliers, the team can still be quite good. But if you don't have them, the team starts to be a little more, definitely not outstanding in the way that you'd probably expect out of an Archon. All in all, Mavuika's a relatively strong character that is very reliant on those Natlan supports. Without them, she's honestly pretty underwhelming. We'll talk a little bit more about her early constellations versus signature when we get into the weapon banner. But for now, let's talk about Citlali. The main thing about Citlali is that she doesn't have reliance on other Natlan characters that Mavuika does. Now, just in terms of assuming you're looking at a good account that has all the things they need, I would expect Mavuika to be a pretty like, fairly strong unit. And while there are going to be a bunch of teams that can use Citlali, I'd probably say that Mavuika is a bit better than Citlali. But if you're only able to get one of them and you don't have Shilonen, I would definitely be leaning more towards Citlali than towards Mavuika. Usually I don't like comparing units to one another too much, but I think it's very relevant in this specific case because it's two new units that are being released at the same time. On top of that, it's two units that work well together, so people that don't have that many primos are probably very interested in knowing which one of the two is better to get if you only end up getting one of them. I'd say if you have Shilonen, Citlali is not necessary at all for Mavuika, but if you don't, the difference between having Citlali as your Natlan character or Kachina is actually massive. It's a very, very big difference. But yeah, Citlali is a cryo shielder that gets most of her value from the ways in which she can consolidate defensive utility with offensive buffs. She is an Atlan character, so she can use the Scrolls of Cinder City, which is 40% damage. She's a Catalyst user, so she can use TTDS, which is 48% attack. And her Ascension 1 passive gives 20% Shred to Pyro and or Hydro. Those three things together makes her an incredibly powerful defensive option for melt teams, to the point of arguably making melt teams real. Now, there are melt teams like in the current version of the game that are fairly good, but they tend to have a lot of issues when it comes to practical applications. If you take, for example, the Arlecchino Kea melt team, which I will be talking about at length when I make a video about Arlecchino because of her rerun, but it is one of the best Arlecchino teams. However, it relies on Kea's application, which can be rough against enemies that move a lot or against multi-wave stuff. And if you lose your Cryo Aura, or if you fuck up your setup in any way, then it's a pretty bad team. With Citlali, not only do you get a lot of defensive utility from the fact that you're using a shielder now, right, with Citlali, but on top of that, because she also provides so much value outside of just the enabling of melts, the team can still be strong even if your melting goes wrong, which opens up a lot of new melt teams on top of the current melt teams. It opens up melt as an option for more characters, because usually when you're looking at melt teams, the cryo units that we have aren't particularly strong by themselves, so unless you are getting the melts, there's no reason to put a cryo unit with your pyro carry. But Citlali provides enough value outside of melt enabling that you can consider putting her on your team, even if it doesn't line up well for melts. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to all the teams that are gonna benefit from Citlali. I think the one I'm looking forward to the most is Gaming Citlali. Obviously Mavuika Citlali as well, but that one's pretty obvious. And then finally Arlecchino Citlali. Or like, those are the main three teams to keep an eye out for Citlali. But she is going to be valuable in a lot of different teams, even in teams where she's not all that synergistic, just because she gives a lot of buffs. Before we get into the 4 stars, I just want to emphasize, while these are fairly good characters, Mavuika isn't so strong that you will get better results from getting Mavuika than from getting C1 on Arlecchino, for example, right? So if you already have Arlecchino, going for Mavuika instead of going for Arlecchino C1 will not be the best option when it comes to increasing the amount of damage that you can do. I wouldn't quite say that she's like game defining. I still think she's going to be one of the better carries, for sure, and her being a carry rather than a support means that it's hard to say how long it will take for Hoyo to release other carries that do as well, if not better than her, because the trend for character releases has definitely been bordering on power creep. And while Citlali is good, the main thing that makes her so good is that she has pretty much no competition in the slot. We don't have good cryo supports, and it's impossible to say how long it's gonna take for Hoyo to release more characters that go in the cryo slot and that are also buffers. And if anything, because Citlali offers defensive utility, it's likely that future cryo supports that don't offer defensive utility will probably give more offensive utility. So keep that in the back of your mind when you're deciding whether or not you want to go for her. The future is impossible to predict, and you shouldn't go for characters that don't appeal to you just because you heard a streamer or a content creator say they were good. If it's not a character you like, if the gameplay loop doesn't seem interesting to you, don't waste your time and don't waste your primos. And more importantly than all, don't spend any money on this shit game. Next up, let's talk about the 4 stars. Diona is a character of all time. Diona is Citlali if Citlali was bad. In her kit, she doesn't offer any buffs. She technically has a buff in her constellations, but the biggest things that prevent Diona from being all that great is that her shield duration isn't that long, it's 12 seconds, but she's not a character you want to swap into right before your carry. She tends to be a character you want to swap into at the start of your rotation, which means that very often your shield will expire while you're on field on your carry, unless you're playing a carry that can swap in and out without too much of a problem. And same for her burst. And she doesn't provide any offensive utility outside of her C6. Her C1 reduces her ER requirements, which is whatever. Her C2 makes your shield a little bit stronger. C3 doesn't matter. C4 doesn't matter. C5 makes the shield a bit stronger. And then C6 makes it so that if your on-field character is above 50% HP, which they should be, it gives them 200 EM. Right now, Diona is mainly used either in teams where you need particle generation, so Ayaka teams, I guess, but she's not particularly great there. Ela teams, but she's also not particularly great there. Or teams where you just need a shielder, and it kind of doesn't matter who it is, like Neuvillette teams for people that want a comfortable clear with them, although she's not particularly great there. Or melt teams. And currently, melt teams aren't all that great. You can use her in Chaska teams, she's fine. You can use her in Gaming teams, where she can be pretty good. But the only reason to put her in those teams is if you have her C6. If you don't have her C6, she's kind of worthless in them. Currently, I'd say that the team that benefits the most from Diona is the Gaming Melt team that uses only 4-star characters. Gaming, Diona, Bennett, Rosaria, which is one of the best 4-star only teams, but which is also one of the most constellation reliant 4-star only teams. The team's DPS gets like tripled between all the characters at C0 versus all of the characters at C6, which is wild of a difference. And you have to deal with a Venn diagram of overlapping circle impact with Diona's burst, Rosaria's burst, and Bennett's burst, which can be really annoying to play with and lead to a lot of issues when it comes to the practical application of the team. But when things go right, it is a strong team. Now, how does that interact with the new upcoming characters? Well, one, you can potentially use Diona in a double Cryo Mavuika team, although I'm a little bit less convinced. It'll work. It'll be one of your options, but eh. And you can use Diona as a second Cryo slot in a double Cryo Citlali Melt team with other carries. So something like Gaming again. And for both of them, she's gonna be one of the options. I think people tend to overestimate Rosaria's impact in those double Cryo Melt teams. They overestimate the amount of damage that Rosaria's doing, and that leads them to thinking that Rosaria is like significantly better than Diona. The reality is that if your application isn't much of a problem, if you're not reliant on Rosaria's application being faster than Diona's, just in terms of damage in those forward melt teams, Rosaria doesn't tend to be a particularly large portion of the damage, so losing that damage by going Diona instead isn't really that big of a deal. Diona will have a place as one of the possible options, even if you're quote-unquote wasting her defensive utility because you already have a shielder in the team, and you maybe also already have a healer if you're playing Citlali and Bennett. Even if she's literally just there for Cryo Resonance and an EM buff, she's still fine. But all in all, she's far from an important character, and she only fulfills that role when she's at C6, because if she's not, she's kind of pretty worthless there. So I don't think it's particularly great news that she's on the banner. Next, Kachina. Now, I've talked a little bit about Kachina and Mavuika teams when I talked about her reliance on Outland characters, and really it boils down to the fact that Kachina is just not a great unit. There are teams where she's fine because she has great synergy with them, which is pretty much teams where her personal damage isn't completely wasted, and there aren't like particularly stronger alternatives, and like she's actually doing something useful. So for example, in Navia teams, obviously Xilonen will be better than Kachina, but if you don't have Xilonen, Kachina is still a viable option because obviously you have that Geo Resonance, and because Kachina has a bit of off-field Geo, she'll give you a bit more crystallizes than Xilonen, which will lead to potentially more reliable shell generation for Navia's skill, which makes it so that the difference in clear time between Kachina teams and Xilonen teams isn't actually all that great. Outside of that, Kachina's always like an okay option as an easily available Cinder City wearer in pretty much any team where your main source of damage is a swirlable element, right? Because as long as you can trigger Crystallize on them, you can proc Cinder City. But she's really not much more than her ability to proc Cinder City. Her personal damage is not completely insignificant, but it's sure not all that great either, which makes her overall kind of a whatever character. And then everyone gets a Kachina for free, so her being on banners only matters for her constellations. But because so much of her value is the set, the constellations really just don't do that much. They are helpful, they increase her personal damage, but they're not all that significant. And then finally, we have Bennett, who is the GOAT. However, Bennett's constellations aren't all that great. That being said, relatively minor buffs to the buffing ability of the best buffer in the game for attack scalers are significant even if they're not major. Because his constellations affect his ability to buff your carry, even if the difference between C0 and C6 Bennett in terms of buffing isn't all that massive, because you're always using Bennett even when he's C0 on those teams, they're pretty much just free upgrades to those teams if you get the constellations. All in all, the difference between C0 and C6 Bennett tends to be the equivalent of somewhere between 30 and 50% attack on your carry, depending on what their base attack is, because it's based on Bennett's base attack, which won't be the same as that of your carry. If you're playing a 5-star carry with high base attack and a 5-star weapon, it's probably going to be closer to like 30-ish. If you're playing playing like, I don't know, a character with Deathmatch or something with much lower base attack, then it could be the equivalent of closer to 50%. And then the potential 15% pyro damage from his C6. Those things together are fairly nice. Generally, the difference between C0 Bennett and C6 Bennett on a team that is running a pyro carry is a little bit less, if not around the same as that carry's first constellation. On most of them, it's a bit less, but for characters that don't have like insane C1s, it can be about the same. And as it turns out, that tends to be pretty nice. Now, because Bennett is a character that's available in the monthly rotating time on bargains, and because he tends to be on banners fairly often, and because he's as good as he is, people tend to already have Bennett. He's the sort of character that you tend to go out of your way to get, so it's relatively likely that if you're not very new, you already have him. And that's honestly the biggest issue with him being on banner. It's that he's so good that if you've been playing for a while, you've probably already gone out of your way to get him in his constellations. Anyways, very quickly going through Bennett's constellations. His C1 is his, depending on how you see it, either his best or his second best constellation. It removes the HP restriction for the attack buff on his burst, and it makes that buff increase by 20% of his attack. Honestly, the second part kind of matters more than the first one. Bennett's healing is real high, so you don't tend to spend a lot of time under 70% HP, which means you don't tend to spend a lot of time not having this buff. C2 gives him ER when his HP is below 70%, but he's not an on-fielder, so his HP shouldn't spend a lot of time below 70% unless you're playing him in Farina teams. So most of the time, his C2 does literally nothing. C3, skill levels. This only matters for Carry Bennett, and while Carry Bennett is honestly not bad and definitely underrated, it's also incredibly unpopular. C4 makes it so that his whole level 1 skill gets an optional third hit. Usually, when you look at Bennett's hold skill, you can either hold it level 1 and get 2 hits, or you can hold it for longer and get a third hit after those 2 hits, which is him falling down and then getting knocked back. If you're doing it inside of his burst, he doesn't get knocked back, but whatever. The C4 makes it so that you can add that downward slash even if you only do charge level 1. Like this. And you don't get knocked back. The biggest way in which this matters is in teams where you need to have 3 pyro applications in quick succession. For example, you've just applied a Hydro, 1 U Hydro onto an opponent, you don't have his C6, and you want to get a Pyro Aura on the enemy to swirl Pyro. So, by default, if you want to get a Pyro Aura so you can swirl, you'd have to do a different setup, or you'd have to do a charge level 2. Like this. With C4, you can effectively just do that faster, which will make your setup a little bit shorter. It's honestly not a big deal in almost every team, but it gives you a little bit more flexibility in your setups, which can be nice. It's also not too bad if you're playing Vape Carry Bennett, but it's also not great because the time you spend charging and doing the animation of the attack is time you can't spend normal attacking for Hydro applicators like Yelan and Singto. In any case, C4 mostly is just an additional option for some setups, but almost never matters. Then C5 is 3 burst levels if you crown his skill. Makes the attack bonus go from 101 to 119, which is 18% more attack, which is also just a nice little increase. It also gives you a bit more healing, which is a nice little upside, I guess, especially in Farina teams. And then finally the C6, which is the one that most people probably want to talk about, which gives you 15% power damage and a Pyro Infusion. Honestly, the more time passes, the less I care about the Pyro Infusion. I've talked about, when I talked about Xianyun, I've talked about how Bennett's C6 can be very helpful to make any melee character potentially a Xianyun carry. The main reason why people may not want to activate this is in fear of that infusion overriding another infusion and preventing your character from doing what they want to do. Now, realistically, that's pretty much only gonna matter in Ela teams, Ayaka teams, and C6 Chiori teams, because other carries either don't really use Bennett or have some way to make this Pyro Infusion either not do anything because it can't be overridden, like Noelle, for example, or work in their favor as an actual upside. The point I'm trying to make here is there really aren't a lot of teams where this is a downside, and I think that for most people, the downside doesn't matter. However, if they want you to hate yourself for activating Bennett C6, they can, right? Chiori is a fairly recent character, and they released her as a character who at C6 gets f***ed by Bennett C6. It's a very frustrating and unsatisfying conclusion, but it is the conclusion I've got, which is do it at your own risk. But yeah, so that pretty much does it for the characters and their constellations. Now, how well do the 4 stars function with the 5 stars on banner? Unironically, not that poorly. Obviously, with Mavuika, you really want Bennett in almost all of her teams. And then if you're a relatively new account, Kachina can function as the Natlan Night Soul Fighting Spirit generator. If you end up going for both Mavuika and Citlali, Diona is a functional last slot in the team as well. So all 3 of these characters can be nice to have on a Mavuika Citlali banner. But because Bennett is a character that so many people already have and potentially have at high constellation, because Diona is such a whatever character in Mavuika team, and because Kachina is only good if you don't have the other good Natlan supports, it's also not a great banner. I'd say it's a fairly nice banner for beginners, but not all that great for long-time players. Which brings us to the weapon banner. We have Mavuika's signature and Citlali's signature, so let's take a look at what those do. So 1,000 Blazing Suns, high base attack with crit rate substats. When it comes to base attack and substat, as a general rule, weapons that have a substat that is not crit, you want them to be high base attack, low substat, because the value of base attack tends to be higher than the value of attack percent, HP percent, defense percent, all that stuff when it comes to attack scalars. But when it comes to crit weapons, the difference in overall output between high base attack weapons and low base attack weapons is honestly not that big. So it really doesn't matter that much. That being said, if they're specifically a crit rate weapon, lower substat, higher base attack tends to be better, at least on attack scalars, because there's just so many ways to get crit in Genshin nowadays, with the release of Marie-José and then Obsidian Codex giving you 36 or 40% crit. It becomes really easy to overcap crit rate, so a weapon that has lower crit rate and higher base attack tends to be easier to make work, especially because double cryo Mavuika teams will definitely be some of the Mavuika teams you can play. And if you're playing double cryo Mavuika, you have Cryo Resonance, you have Obsidian Codex, you can have Rosaria, and then with this, that's a lot of crit rate. So you're happy that it's high base attack, low substat instead of the other way around. And then the passive, gain the Scorching Brilliance effect when using skill or burst. Crit damage increased by 20% and attack increased by 28% for 6 seconds. If your normal attack and charge attacks deal elemental damage, the duration is increased by 2 seconds up to 12. Additionally, when the equipping character is in the Night Soul Blessing state, the effects are increased by 75%. In other words, because pretty much every character has a skill and a burst, this is a relatively generic 20% crit damage and 28% attack that also has an increased effect on Natlan characters with 35% crit damage and 49% attack. For Mavuika, this tends to be a little bit north of 25% better than her best free-to-play weapon. However, that is in reaction teams. In non-reaction teams, Mavuika doesn't have the greatest free-to-play options, whereas in reaction teams, she potentially has access to Mailed Flower. On top of that, not everyone even has Mailed Flower. Because it was an event weapon. All in all, her weapon it's definitely in line with other recent 5-star weapons. The question is it better to go for the weapon or for her constellations? I'd say it kind of depends. So let me very quickly talk about Mavuika's C1, which is part of my frustration with her kit. At C1, her skills Night Soul point generation is increased to 120 instead of 80, and she gains Fighting Spirit 25% more efficiently, so each point of Night Soul will give you 1.25 Fighting Spirit. In other words, this becomes 120 plus 10 from the burst, so 130 Night Soul points, which gives you 162.5 Fighting Spirit just from herself. And because she caps out at 200, it means that you pretty much get most of your Night Soul without needing an Atlan character. Now, obviously, if you can cap it out, it's better than not capping it out, but she's not actually reliant on capping it out. There are actually a decent amount of teams where you don't cap it out. Most of the double cryo teams, the double cryo teams that use Bennett double cryo, generally will not be capping out her fighting spirit. This makes those teams slightly better because it makes it so that you cap it, but it also, and maybe more importantly, enables the ability to play her without other Natlan characters. What that means is if you don't like Citlali and you don't like Shilonen, you can get her C1 and play her without other Natlan characters. But man, does it feel scummy when C1 is a solution to a kit restriction. Especially when that kit restriction is, by default, preventing her from having good teams that don't have other specific 5-star characters. This feels really scummy. I don't like it at all, but it is what it is. In terms of actual value in her good teams, it's arguably a bigger deal that she gets 40% attack than it is that she gets more Night Soul point generation. It's a fairly reasonable C1 just in terms of power when you look at her teams that are already good. It'll generally do a little bit less than her signature, so if you're choosing between C1 and Sig, I'd lean more towards Sig, but it's not as bad as like Raiden's C1, for example. Then C2, when in Night Soul's Blessing state, Mavuika's base attack is increased by 200. That's her base attack. What that means is that the actual amount of attack that she gets is going to be closer to like 500 because it's attack that gets affected by attack percent. So power resonance, noblesse, attack percent in artifacts, TTDS, all that stuff is going to affect this 200. And she gains the following effects. Her off-field skill gets 20% Death Shred, which is okay, but it doesn't debuff resistance for her on-field stuff, only for her off-field stuff. And then for her on-field stuff, she gets slightly higher potion value on her burst and on her target attacks. All in all, this is a fairly strong C2. If you're looking at C1R1 versus C2R0, I'd lean more towards C2R0. Next up, we have Citlali's signature weapon, Starcallers Watch. Low base attack, high substat, and because Citlali is a character that is not entirely an attack scaler, that's something you're pretty happy with. EM substat 265 EM, an additional 100 EM from the passive, and gain the Mirror of Night effect within 15 seconds after the equipping character creates a shield. The current active party member deals 28% increased damage to nearby opponents. You can gain the Mirror of Night effects once every 14 seconds. In terms of amount, this buff tends to be a little bit less valuable than the 48% attack you get from TTDS. However, it lasts for longer, and it stays even if you swap in and out of a character, so you have a bit more flexibility in your rotations, and it actually gives EM and a pretty good amount of it. Overall, this is a fairly decent weapon, but because TTDS is so good, it's a relatively minor upgrade in Citlali teams where TTDS is useful. It'll be a more significant upgrade in Citlali teams like Citlali with Neuvillette, where you don't have a good recipient for that TTDS buff. But in most situations, this is honestly not worth going for. And then finally, we have the 4-star weapons. So first, Lithic Blade, pretty bad, pretty not good. It's not a completely worthless weapon, but weapons like that like aren't really good at R1 and that are weapon banner exclusive, so you aren't that likely to get that many refines on them, already start with a handicap. And then on top of that, when you look at Leia Claymore characters, most of them are played in teams that don't have many other Leia characters. Pretty much the only thing I can think of the top of my head that uses a good amount of Leia characters where you could use Lithic Blade is like Gaming, Xianyan, Yelan, Farina maybe. But in those teams, attack percent is so much less valuable than EM that Lithic Blade isn't much of an upgrade over Rain Slasher. All in all, Lithic Blade is honestly just not all that great. Favonius Codex is a fairly good weapon. Now, because TTDS exists, there's a bit less room for Fav weapons dominance in the Catalyst slot. However, there are a decent amount of teams where TTDS doesn't do that much. If you look, for example, at Hyperbloom teams, Favonius Codex tends to be really good for Nahida. If you look at Mona teams, TTDS is good, but her ER requirements tend to be so high that Fav can still be nice because it's possible your artifacts don't allow for you to use TTDS. And honestly, there's just not that many characters that care that much about Fav in the Catalyst slot. But the ones that do quite like it. In my opinion, Fav Codex is like around the same value as Fav Bow in that it can be good, but it's not a necessary weapon on an account. Fav Lance is amazing because there's just so many polearm characters that want Fav. I end up talking about this every time Fav Lance is on banner, but I'll talk about it again. I don't care. So many of the polearm characters have Fav as either their very best option, their very best 4-star option, or at the very least, a competitive 4-star options with other weapons. With Stringless, it's the very best option for her in quite a few teams, namely teams where her personal damage tends to be relatively low and her ER requirements are hard to fulfill. So for example, Molani teams. With Zhongli, it's almost always just his best weapon, period, because your shield won't break even if you're not on Black Tassel, and no other weapon gives you proper support utility outside of Fav in the polearm slot. On Xiao, it's like a little bit of a cope weapon, but it's not even that bad. Not good on Hu Tao. On Rosaria, it tends to be either best in slot or at least best in slot 4-star in a lot of her teams. On Raiden, it tends to be either her best or second best option in Raiden teams that don't focus mainly on Raiden's damage, which is to say the rational teams. On Toma, it's his best weapon in teams where he's not used as an EM trigger. On Yunjin, it tends to be her best in slot. On Shenhe, it is often competitive with her signature, if not better, if you don't have her C1, because the particle generation is just too good. On Candace, it's often her best in slot. On Sino, it's not good. On Yao Yao, it's often her best in slot. On Mika, it's pretty much his best in slot. On Chevaliers, it's pretty much her best in slot. Or like, it's bad. On MD, it's an option. And on Kachina, it's, at the very least, yeah, it's pretty much her best in slot. All of this to say, there is just such an overabundance of polearm characters that want Fav, which makes Fav Lance one of the best 4-star weapons in the game. Next up, Sac Sword. Sac Sword is the age-old Singto weapon. At least that's how people perceive it. In reality, it's not that great on Singto. In a lot of situations, Fav is better. However, if you're like me and you only have 2 Favs, and much like Fav Lance, Fav Sword is a very competitive weapon on so many characters. Having a Sac Sword on top of your Fav Sword means that at least you won't have to put your Singto on a bad weapon. If you're playing Singto in a national team, being able to vape his skill makes Sac Sword better because you can vape it. You can get up to 4 vapes with it, which is nice. If you want to play teams where Singto represents a low portion of your damage, but is your cooldown gate because of his 21 seconds skill cooldown, you can potentially play Sac Sword and do 1 skill Singto just to remove the skill cooldowns, that instead you're gated by the 20-second burst cooldown, which is like okay. But honestly, it's more just like an okay weapon on Singto than the perceived best in slot. And alternatively, it's relatively underrated on characters like Kazuha, where the additional grouping can be quite valuable. All that to say, Sac Sword is like a fine weapon, but it's not all that great either. It's an okay. It's like pretty average. And then finally, Stringless, which is very good for Fischl in aggravate teams. And outside of that, it's like an okay stat stick on a bunch of other characters, but that's kind of it. It's really mostly for Fischl that it's good. In some Chevaliers teams, it's also good. And it's also potentially good on Auron, depending on your team. All in all, Stringless, I'd say, is above average for bows, which means that the overall 4-star lineup, I'd say, is a little bit better than what you usually get, a little bit better than average. But the 5-star lineup, it's not bad, but the way I see it, Citlali's signature is just kind of whatever. The bright side is that if you're going for Mavuika's weapon and you do get Citlali, Mavuika's best team uses Citlali, and so if you do end up losing your 37.5, 62.5 on Mavuika's signature, and you lose it to this, it's still a weapon that's gonna be a slight buff to the Mavuika team. It's not going to be completely wasted. But it won't be a large buff, and I'd say that as a general rule, you'd gain a lot more from a 5-star stat stick for your second side carry than you will from Starcallers Watch. All in all, for Mavuika, this weapon banner is honestly about average. If you're specifically an Omega Whale Leviathan, and you end up getting Starcallers Watch Refines on the way to our 5,000 Blazing Suns, then the gap between it and TDDS is bigger, so like at least there's that, but yeah. All in all, this weapon banner is slightly above average, and this character banner is pretty significantly below average for long-term players. but about average, if not slightly above average, for new players that could actually benefit from the Bennett cons. But yeah, that pretty much does it for the banner review. So as usual, I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.